They believed hurting his family would be forgotten over time. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed a steady man would eventually grow tired, accept the loss, and quietly fold into the background of the town he once helped build. What they did not understand was this: some men do not raise their voices when they are wounded. Some men lower them. And when they do, it is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of patience sharpening itself. The town of Alder Ridge had always trusted men in pressed shirts and polished boots. It trusted ribbon cuttings, charity luncheons, and firm handshakes held just a second longer than necessary. It trusted success stories printed in the local paper. At the center of that trust stood Harlan Pierce and Mitchell Rowe, co-owners of the region's largest construction firm. They sponsored youth baseball teams, funded scholarship programs, and built half the commercial properties lining Main Street. Their names were etched into plaques and donor walls. Their reputations felt permanent. Grant Whitaker never cared for plaques. He had partnered with Harlan and Mitchell 5 years earlier, bringing with him quiet capital, strategic oversight, and a reputation for meticulous planning. Grant was not charismatic, but he was steady. He believed in clean contracts, careful expansion, and earned growth. He believed that integrity did not need decoration. His wife, Eleanor Whitaker, understood that about him. She had built her own place in Alder Ridge through community volunteer work and patient listening. She knew everyone's birthdays, everyone's losses, everyone's quiet struggles. Their son, Caleb, watched both of them with the attentive silence of a boy who learned more from observation than instruction. For a time, the partnership appeared solid. Quarterly reports arrived on schedule. Expansion plans unfolded smoothly. Harlan handled public relations. Mitchell oversaw operations. Grant reviewed financial statements with disciplined focus. The numbers aligned. Or so they seemed. The shift did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared in small inconsistencies. A line item adjusted without prior discussion. A revised amendment to an operating agreement filed quietly. A minor signature variance explained away as administrative oversight. Nothing large enough to provoke alarm. Nothing loud enough to justify confrontation. Grant felt it before he understood it. Something subtle. Something misaligned. He did not accuse. He did not speculate. He watched. Publicly, nothing changed. Handshakes continued. Smiles remained fixed. Eleanor noticed the slight tightening in Grant's posture at community gatherings, but he never spoke poorly of his partners. Caleb saw his father reviewing documents later into the evening, glasses low on his nose, pages arranged in orderly stacks. No raised voice echoed through the Whitaker home. No doors slammed. If the town expected visible fracture, it did not receive it. Instead, Grant began documenting. He requested copies of past filings under the pretense of routine review. He compared early partnership drafts to recent amendments. He cross-referenced vendor payments against approved budgets. He tracked dates. He noted signatures. He built timelines. The process was unhurried. Deliberate. Quiet. Harlan Pierce believed complexity protected him. Mitchell Rowe believed reputation insulated him. Both assumed that if discrepancies were small enough and gradual enough, they would dissolve into the natural fog of business operations. They assumed that even if noticed, the discomfort would fade. Time, after all, had a way of dulling outrage. But time does not dull everything. Sometimes it preserves. The first undeniable fracture emerged inside a revised capital allocation schedule. Grant noticed that a secondary holding entity, one he did not recall authorizing, had received redirected distributions over 18 months. The entity traced back to a limited liability structure registered under a distant address. The paperwork bore his signature, or something resembling it. Close enough to pass a glance. Not close enough to survive scrutiny. He did not confront Harlan. He did not question Mitchell. He did not mention it to Eleanor, not yet. Instead, he requested archived digital copies of original signed agreements from the firm's compliance portal. The portal showed access logs. Access logs showed timestamps. Timestamps revealed edits occurring after finalized approvals. Grant felt no rush of anger. He felt clarity. At a town fundraising dinner weeks later, Harlan clasped Grant's shoulder in a gesture of public camaraderie. Mitchell raised a glass in subtle acknowledgement across the room. Eleanor smiled with practiced warmth. Caleb observed the exchange carefully. Around them, conversations hummed with comfortable admiration for the men who had built Alder Ridge. The Whitakers did not correct the narrative. At home, Grant installed a secondary filing cabinet inside his study closet. It remained locked. He began scanning documents into encrypted storage. He organized financial summaries chronologically. He made notes in the margins, never emotional, always factual. Patterns emerged where isolated incidents once stood. Adjustments aligned with project milestones. Redirected funds coincided with expansion announcements. The strategy was not reckless. It was systematic. Eleanor eventually sensed the weight of what was unfolding. She asked no direct questions, but she recognized the stillness settling over her husband. It was not resignation. It was calculation. She responded in kind by maintaining their family rhythm without disruption. Caleb continued school. Dinners continued at 6. Sunday mornings remained sacred. The Whitaker household did not fracture. The town, however, began whispering gently about investment missteps. A delayed dividend here. A postponed distribution there. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to imply that perhaps Grant had overextended himself. The narrative adjusted subtly, favoring the charismatic over the meticulous. Grant allowed it. He understood something fundamental about human nature: people grow comfortable with simplified stories. They prefer heroes who smile easily and explanations that require no investigation. He would not attempt to fight perception prematurely. He would not engage in public defense. There would be no emotional appeals. No dramatic exposures. There would be timing. As autumn settled over Alder Ridge, Grant completed a comparative analysis of every partnership document signed since inception. The pattern no longer resembled coincidence. It resembled intention. Funds had not merely shifted, they had been rerouted with precision. Authority had not merely been adjusted, it had been restructured quietly around him. Harlan and Mitchell believed the Whitakers would move forward, absorb the loss, and retreat into privacy. They believed injury, when not loudly protested, eventually dissolves. They mistook silence for surrender. That evening, after Eleanor and Caleb had gone to bed, Grant remained in his study. The house was still. Streetlights cast long amber shadows across the lawn. He opened the closet door and knelt beside the newly installed cabinet. From his pocket, he removed a small key he had not used before. He unlocked the drawer and placed inside it a neatly bound stack of documents, certified copies, annotated timelines, access logs, and a summary memorandum outlining discrepancies in careful, unemotional language. Grant Whitaker did not move on. And that night, as the town slept peacefully under the assumption that time would erase what had been done, he closed the cabinet, turned the key, and began preparing for something no one in Alder Ridge saw coming. They believed paper fades. They believed ink loses meaning with time. They believed that if enough documents were layered over the truth, the original signature would disappear beneath administrative noise. What they did not understand was that Grant Whitaker did not read paperwork the way most men did. He read it the way other men read character. Slowly. Patiently. Looking for what did not belong. In the weeks following the quiet realization that something was wrong, Grant began reconstructing the history of his own partnership as if he were studying the records of strangers. He removed emotion from the equation and treated the matter as an intellectual exercise. Dates first. Then versions. Then amendments. He requested archived filings from the state database, comparing submission timestamps with internal corporate revisions. What he discovered was not a single glaring alteration but a sequence of subtle shifts that, when viewed together, formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. The altered contracts were elegant in their deception. Clauses governing profit distribution had been reworded slightly, redistributing percentages under the guise of expansion risk mitigation. Capital contribution schedules were revised retroactively, reflecting additional voluntary adjustments attributed to Grant's account. Each change appeared minor when isolated. Each signature bore his name. Yet the spacing between letters varied. The slant of the ink drifted. The pressure marks beneath the surface of the paper told a different story. Forged signatures had been buried within layers of corporate amendments that few people would ever review line by line. The architecture of the fraud relied on exhaustion. Most partners would skim. Most investors would trust. Harlan Pierce understood that confidence often substitutes for scrutiny. Mitchell Rowe relied on the assumption that procedural density intimidates even intelligent men. Grant was not intimidated. He began cross-referencing financial discrepancies with amendment dates. Dividends that should have been issued were rerouted to secondary holding accounts tied to a subsidiary formed 18 months after the partnership's inception. The subsidiary's address corresponded to an office suite in another state, one known primarily for hosting registered entities rather than active operations. The entity manager listed on state records had indirect ties to Mitchell through prior ventures. None of this was obvious at first glance. It required time, and Grant gave it time. Meanwhile, the public narrative evolved gently but persistently. Whispers suggested that the Whitakers had miscalculated their exposure. That perhaps Grant had been overly cautious during key growth periods, slowing returns. That maybe Eleanor's community commitments distracted from financial vigilance. No one voiced these speculations with cruelty. They arrived wrapped in concern, in sympathetic head tilts and carefully phrased observations about market volatility. Alder Ridge did not enjoy scandal, it preferred softened explanations. Eleanor absorbed the shift in tone without resentment. She continued volunteering at the community center, offering warmth to families who had no awareness of her private uncertainty. There was grace in her composure. She did not defend her husband publicly because he had not asked her to. She trusted his silence. In the evenings, she noticed the increasing neatness of the study, stacks of documents arranged with almost meditative precision. She sensed movement beneath stillness. Caleb watched more closely than anyone realized. He observed how his father no longer reacted to passing remarks about business performance. He noticed how Grant's questions at dinner became more reflective, less reactive. The boy learned that strength does not always appear as confrontation. Sometimes it appears as attention. Inside the locked study, Grant organized documentation meticulously. He created binders categorized by fiscal year. He annotated margin notes with references to corresponding bank transfers. He downloaded metadata from digital documents to identify editing histories. Emails were not printed for outrage, they were cataloged for sequence. Discovery texts, internal communications between Harlan and Mitchell, were referenced through backup server retrieval logs that revealed private coordination before public board approvals. Grant did not interpret tone. He mapped chronology. Something feels off transformed into measurable proof. Patterns converged. Transfers aligned with personal real estate acquisitions by Harlan's extended holdings. Corporate expense reimbursements corresponded with Mitchell's private travel investments. None of these transactions alone constituted criminal behavior. Together, however, they illustrated intent to diminish a partner's stake while preserving plausible deniability. Grant felt no impulse to accuse. Accusation would require emotional exposure. Exposure would alert his opponents prematurely. Instead, silence deepened into strategy. He began researching forensic accountants specializing in partnership disputes. After careful consideration, he contacted a firm in a neighboring city under the pretense of routine audit consultation. He traveled alone, carrying only summarized copies rather than originals, maintaining control over the narrative. The forensic accountant assigned to review the materials possessed a quiet demeanor that matched Grant's own. Their initial meeting lasted 3 hours. Grant presented documents sequentially, offering context without embellishment. He did not express betrayal. He expressed curiosity about irregularities. The accountant reviewed signature comparisons under magnification, examined transaction layering, and noted the structural relationship between the subsidiary entity and the parent firm. When Grant returned home that evening, Eleanor sensed a subtle shift. Not relief. Not anger. Something steadier. Confirmation. He did not share details immediately. He simply joined her at the kitchen table, placed his hand over hers, and allowed silence to communicate reassurance rather than fear. Caleb noticed that his father slept more soundly that night. Harlan Pierce, meanwhile, believed complexity guaranteed safety. He trusted that the administrative maze he and Mitchell constructed would discourage challenge. Mitchell assumed Grant lacked either the appetite or the financial resources to pursue extended investigation. Both misjudged the temperament of a man who valued patience over spectacle. Timing became central. The accountant requested additional records, including internal approval logs and vendor contracts predating the subsidiary's creation. Grant agreed but insisted on discretion. He understood that premature exposure could trigger document alteration or narrative spin. He would not grant that advantage. He returned to Alder Ridge, continuing business interactions with measured civility. Handshakes remained firm. Smiles remained intact. Over the next several weeks, encrypted communications flowed between Grant and the accountant. Spreadsheets expanded. Comparative analyses strengthened. What began as suspicion matured into structured evidence. The architecture of deception grew clearer, its elegance now stripped of invisibility. It was not chaotic greed. It was methodical extraction disguised as administrative refinement. One late afternoon, Grant received a preliminary findings memorandum. He read it alone in his study, sunlight fading across the neatly organized binders. The document did not rely on emotional language. It relied on arithmetic, metadata, and statutory references. It confirmed forged authorizations. It identified unauthorized redistribution. It outlined potential breaches of fiduciary duty. But it did more than that. The accountant's summary included an appendix referencing compliance obligations tied to federal contracting disclosures, obligations that, if misrepresented, extended beyond private partnership dispute into regulatory violation. Grant understood immediately that this was no longer confined to a single contract or personal grievance. The structure of concealment intersected with reporting requirements that carried consequences far greater than financial restitution. He closed the memorandum carefully and placed it atop the locked cabinet. The accountant had not just confirmed fraud. He had uncovered something larger than a single contract. They believed hurting his family would dissolve into routine. They believed generosity displayed in public could dilute what was taken in private. They believed that if enough scholarships were funded and enough charity galas were hosted, no one would ever question the architecture beneath the applause. What they failed to consider was that Grant Whitaker had begun to see the system not as a business, but as a design. And once a design is understood, it cannot be unseen. Alder Ridge admired polished confidence. The annual foundation dinner hosted by Harlan Pierce and Mitchell Rowe had become a ritual of civic pride. Crystal glasses reflected warm light across linen-covered tables. Checks were presented with gracious smiles. Photographs were taken beneath banners celebrating growth and opportunity. Harlan's voice carried easily through banquet halls, steady and reassuring. Mitchell stood slightly behind him, nodding with measured humility. Together, they represented stability. Grant attended these events without resistance. He observed rather than participated. He noticed which city council members leaned closest to Harlan during private conversations. He watched how Mitchell deflected technical questions with practiced warmth. He noted how easily admiration could be cultivated when it was fed consistently. The system did not rely on secrecy alone, it relied on loyalty shaped by generosity. As documentation accumulated in his study, Grant began tracing the partnership's early history more carefully. He discovered that his own experience was not isolated. Minority partners who had invested during expansion phases quietly exited within 2 to 3 years. Their departures were framed publicly as strategic shifts or personal decisions. None pursued litigation. None challenged the narrative. On paper, each exit appeared voluntary. But numbers, when aligned chronologically, told a quieter story. Each partner's equity diluted gradually before departure. Capital calls increased unpredictably. Amendments adjusted voting thresholds subtly. Patterns repeated with careful variation. The architecture of exploitation was patient. It never overreached. It simply recalibrated until the minority voice diminished into administrative irrelevance. Grant did not feel outrage. He felt clarity deepen. He researched those former partners discreetly, discovering that several had relocated to larger cities, restructuring careers far from Alder Ridge. One had retired early under ambiguous circumstances. Another shifted industries entirely. None publicly criticized Harlan or Mitchell. Silence, he realized, had been purchased not through intimidation, but through exhaustion. Challenging the system would have required resources, time, and emotional stamina that many were unwilling to sacrifice. The town's loyalty remained anchored to visible generosity. Scholarships funded first-generation college students. Renovations improved community centers. Harlan and Mitchell appeared indispensable. Reputation, once established, formed its own shield. Alder Ridge did not easily question benefactors. Grant studied the psychology of his opponents with detached precision. Harlan thrived on admiration. He required public affirmation to validate private ambition. Mitchell preferred operational control, believing procedural complexity provided insulation. Both men underestimated patience. They assumed that injury must be loud to be dangerous. They believed time erases outrage because outrage, in their experience, flared and faded. Grant understood something different. Time builds leverage. As months progressed, Eleanor noticed a transformation in her husband that did not resemble anger. He moved with increased steadiness. His decisions felt measured rather than reactive. Even his posture shifted, shoulders relaxed not from resignation but from focus. When community members offered sympathetic remarks about market fluctuations, he responded with calm acknowledgement rather than defense. Eleanor recognized that his silence had evolved beyond observation. It had become preparation. Documentation expanded beyond financial discrepancies. Grant created relational maps illustrating how subsidiary entities interconnected. He traced legal counsel overlaps, identifying attorneys who represented both the primary firm and external holdings. He noted patterns in contract timing relative to charitable announcements, observing how public goodwill often coincided with private restructuring. None of this indicated recklessness. It indicated design. External legal consultation began quietly. Grant contacted a regulatory attorney outside the county, one with experience in fiduciary duty litigation and compliance oversight. Their conversations remained hypothetical in tone. Grant presented facts without accusation, inviting professional interpretation rather than validation of personal grievance. The attorney advised patience, emphasizing the importance of comprehensive evidence before escalation. Financial reconstruction followed. Grant recalculated his initial capital contributions against documented distributions, adjusting for unauthorized reallocations. He built spreadsheets projecting what returns should have been under original terms. The disparity widened with each verified amendment. The loss was not catastrophic in a single year, it accumulated through subtle erosion. Throughout this process, there was no language of revenge within the Whittaker home. Eleanor maintained warmth in daily routines. Caleb continued observing quietly, absorbing lessons about resilience without bitterness. Grant never spoke of punishment. He spoke, when necessary, of accuracy. At a spring charity auction, Harlan delivered a speech celebrating the firm's commitment to transparency and community trust. Applause filled the hall. Grant listened without visible reaction, aware that the applause itself reinforced the illusion of stability. He did not resent the crowd. He understood human preference for comforting narratives. The system was built not only on forged signatures but on collective willingness to believe in polished men. As legal consultations deepened, Grant's attorney requested additional compliance disclosures related to the firm's involvement in federally funded infrastructure projects. These projects required specific certifications affirming accurate ownership structures and financial representations. Grant retrieved archived submission packets and compared them against internal equity modifications. The alignment raised quiet concern. One evening, after reviewing a batch of disclosures, Grant paused. A particular transaction tied to the subsidiary entity corresponded directly with a federal reporting period. The funds had been redirected before official filings were submitted. The ownership percentages declared in compliance documents did not match the reconstructed equity structure reflected in amended internal agreements. He felt no surge of triumph. Only gravity. If misrepresented ownership influenced federal contract eligibility, the matter extended beyond private betrayal. It intersected with regulatory accountability. The implications were no longer confined to restitution between partners. They carried institutional weight. Eleanor found him in the study later that night, seated beside organized binders and annotated spreadsheets. She did not ask what he had discovered. She saw it in the stillness of his expression, in the quiet resolve settling across his features. He reached for her hand gently, grounding himself not in anger but in responsibility. Harlan and Mitchell believed their system invulnerable because it was admired. They believed smiles secured permanence. They believed time would soften scrutiny. They did not understand that time, in the hands of a patient man, becomes evidence. Grant closed the compliance file carefully and marked a page with deliberate precision. He had discovered a transaction that linked the fraud to a federal compliance violation. They believed his quiet meant surrender. They believed that if a man did not protest publicly, he had accepted his loss privately. They mistook composure for weakness and civility for defeat. What they did not realize was that silence, in the hands of a patient man, can become the sharpest instrument in the room. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It waits. And in waiting, it gathers weight. Grant Whittaker did not confront Harlan Pierce or Mitchell Rowe after discovering the compliance discrepancy. He did not request urgent meetings. He did not hint at suspicion. Instead, he continued attending quarterly reviews with the same measured professionalism he had always carried. His tone remained steady. His posture remained relaxed. If anything, he appeared less burdened than before. That, more than anger, reassured his partners. Public civility became part of the strategy. Grant congratulated Harlan at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new municipal project. He nodded respectfully during Mitchell's operational briefings. When townspeople commented gently about market volatility and shifting profit margins, he responded with calm acknowledgement. There were no defensive explanations. No visible strain. Alder Ridge slowly concluded that the Whittakers had absorbed the financial disappointment and chosen dignity over dispute. Eleanor supported that perception without rehearsing it. She continued her work at the community center, organizing literacy programs and coordinating seasonal drives. Her warmth did not feel forced. It felt intentional. She understood that stability at home would protect Caleb from absorbing the undercurrent of tension flowing beneath adult conversations. Their dining table remained a place of gratitude, not grievance. Inside the study, however, the private evidence archive expanded with disciplined precision. Grant acquired certified copies of bank statements spanning 5 years, cross-referencing them against declared partnership distributions. He mapped irregular transfers to shell accounts tied to the subsidiary entity previously uncovered. Tax filings revealed discrepancies in declared ownership percentages relative to internal restructuring amendments. Each irregularity was catalogued without commentary. The binders grew heavier. Omnisciently, the architecture of deception began to show strain. Harlan's confidence, once cautious, shifted toward complacency. He authorized accelerated expansion into neighboring counties, leveraging federal infrastructure grants that required strict compliance reporting. Mitchell streamlined accounting systems, consolidating oversight under fewer administrators to increase efficiency. In doing so, they reduced the number of eyes capable of noticing subtle inconsistencies. Their belief in invulnerability grew quietly. Grant noticed the shift immediately. Carelessness does not announce itself loudly, it emerges in small oversights. A delayed filing here. A misdated transfer there. An internal memo referencing an account that should not have existed. He documented each one with clinical restraint. There was no satisfaction in the accumulation. Only confirmation that patience was altering the balance of power. Caleb watched his father with deepening awareness. He observed how Grant separated emotion from action, how he chose reflection over reaction. The boy learned that discipline is not suppression, it is direction. He began organizing his own schoolwork with similar meticulousness, mirroring what he saw modeled at home. Without formal instruction, resilience transferred generationally. Legal groundwork matured in parallel. Grant's regulatory attorney advised careful sequencing. Evidence needed to be airtight before formal complaint. Federal compliance authorities required documented correlation between misrepresentation and material benefit. Grant supplied supplementary analyses, including timeline overlays aligning ownership manipulation with contract awards. He did not rush the process. He understood that premature exposure would allow narrative distortion. Timing became central not as revenge but as structural precision. Filing too early could frame the dispute as a disgruntled partnership disagreement. Filing at the correct moment would reveal systemic misconduct intersecting with regulatory obligations. The distinction mattered. Grant recalculated key reporting deadlines, identifying when federal audit cycles intersected with annual disclosures. He marked those dates quietly in his calendar. Throughout this period, there were no victory speeches in private. Eleanor never heard language of humiliation or retribution. She saw instead a man anchored in principle, motivated not by spectacle but by correction. At night, when the house grew still, she sometimes sensed the emotional weight he carried. Yet he did not allow bitterness to settle. He practiced a form of acceptance that did not excuse wrongdoing but refused to let it define his character. Harlan and Mitchell, believing the Whitakers subdued, expanded their philanthropic visibility. A new scholarship bore Harlan's family name. Mitchell joined a regional advisory board. Their reputations appeared stronger than ever. Public admiration insulated them further. They interpreted Grant's continued civility as confirmation that the matter had dissolved. They did not understand that silence can operate on a longer timeline than arrogance anticipates. One late afternoon, Grant received a final memorandum from his attorney summarizing the evidentiary foundation required to proceed. The document outlined fiduciary breaches, fraudulent signature verification results, ownership misrepresentation tied to federal compliance certifications, and projected restitution calculations. It recommended immediate filing. Grant read it carefully, then closed it without signing. He was not waiting for emotional satisfaction. He was waiting for structural alignment. Weeks later, as Harlan finalized a substantial infrastructure contract contingent upon accurate compliance disclosures, Grant recognized the convergence he had anticipated. The contract's execution triggered mandatory review windows by oversight agencies. Any discrepancy filed during this window would carry amplified scrutiny. The timing was neither impulsive nor cruel. It was precise. That evening, Grant sat alone in his study, the evidence archive arranged methodically across his desk. He prepared a formal complaint detailing documented breaches, attaching certified copies and forensic analyses. His language remained restrained, factual, devoid of accusation beyond substantiated claim. He signed the document with steady hand. Yet he did not submit it. Instead, he placed the complaint into a sealed envelope, labeled with the appropriate agency reference, and secured it within the locked cabinet that had begun this quiet transformation. He noted the audit window opening date on his calendar and calculated the exact morning the filing would initiate maximum procedural impact. Grant Whitaker believed in consequences that unfold cleanly, without spectacle. He believed accountability should feel inevitable rather than explosive. As he turned the key in the cabinet, he understood that the long game had reached its final stage. He had finalized a sealed complaint that would not be filed immediately, but at the exact moment it would do the most damage. They believed they had won. They believed the absence of confrontation meant the absence of consequence. They believed that if a man continued to shake their hands and attend their events, he must have accepted his place beneath them. What they could not see was that Grant Whitaker's silence was not submission. It was calibration. And while they celebrated their expansion, he was measuring the exact height from which they would fall, without ever pushing. Harlan Pierce expanded aggressively in the months that followed. New subdivisions broke ground on the outskirts of Alder Ridge. Commercial complexes were announced with confident projections and carefully staged press photographs. His voice carried through microphones with the tone of a man certain of permanence. Investors applauded his ambition. The town admired his boldness. Mitchell Row matched that momentum with operational expansion. He secured additional public contracts tied to regional infrastructure grants. He consolidated accounting oversight under a leaner team, streamlining approvals for efficiency. He invested in civic boards and advisory committees, positioning himself as both businessman and community steward. To most observers, their success appeared not only intact but accelerating. They interpreted Grant's continued composure as confirmation of their safety. In private conversations, they speculated that he lacked the appetite for protracted dispute. They believed his temperament, steady and restrained, signaled reluctance rather than resolve. Silence, in their minds, equaled retreat. Community confidence in them deepened. Newspaper editorials praised their resilience in uncertain markets. Scholarship ceremonies featured their names prominently. Alder Ridge preferred narratives of growth, and Harlan and Mitchell provided them generously. The illusion of safety solidified. Grant allowed it. He attended the groundbreaking of a new municipal complex without visible tension. He reviewed quarterly summaries without objection. He permitted capital reinvestment initiatives to proceed. Each decision was intentional. He was waiting not for emotional satisfaction but for structural overextension. Aggressive growth requires leverage. Leverage requires disclosure. Disclosure invites scrutiny. Strategic patience defined his rhythm. He embodied the quiet promise he had once formed in solitude, to watch and wait. While Harlan pursued expansion headlines, Grant analyzed balance sheets for signs of overcommitment. While Mitchell optimized operational flow, Grant traced compliance reporting schedules tied to each federally funded contract. He observed how growth increased their exposure to regulatory review cycles. At home, Eleanor sensed the tightening convergence of events. She did not question her husband's restraint, yet internally she felt the weight of impending shift. There is a particular tension that precedes change, not loud but palpable, like air thickening before a storm. She trusted Grant's judgment, even when the timeline stretched longer than comfort would prefer. Her trust was not passive. It was active faith in his discipline. Caleb, now more aware than ever, sensed inevitability without understanding specifics. He noticed how his father marked dates quietly in a leather-bound planner. He observed the deliberate calm in Grant's movements, as if every action was paced according to an invisible clock. From this, the boy absorbed a lesson about endurance, that justice sometimes moves slowly not because it is weak, but because it is thorough. Federal reporting deadlines approached with mechanical certainty. Infrastructure grants required annual compliance certifications affirming accurate ownership structures and financial disclosures. Audit windows narrowed as project funding disbursements increased. The more aggressively Harlan and Mitchell expanded, the more documentation they were obligated to submit. Each submission created another opportunity for inconsistency to surface. Grant coordinated quietly with regulatory authorities through his attorney. Preliminary inquiries were framed as requests for clarification rather than accusations. Documentation packets were prepared with chronological precision. Forensic analyses were updated to reflect recent financial statements. There was no urgency in his tone, only readiness. He ensured that when the moment arrived, the complaint would not appear reactive. It would appear inevitable. Meanwhile, Harlan finalized negotiations on his largest contract yet, a regional infrastructure initiative that would anchor his firm's reputation beyond county lines. The project promised long-term profitability and elevated visibility. Mitchell celebrated the operational milestone privately, confident that their streamlined systems could handle the scale. They saw expansion as validation. Grant saw convergence. He understood that this contract triggered a new layer of federal oversight, including mandatory ownership verification aligned with compliance disclosures. Any misrepresentation, even historical, could jeopardize eligibility and prompt comprehensive audit. The timing he had calculated months earlier now aligned precisely with reporting obligations. Everything was in place: documented forged signatures, unauthorized equity shifts, subsidiary shell transfers, and compliance discrepancies. Eleanor felt the shift the evening before the contract signing. Grant was quieter than usual, not burdened but focused. They sat together in the dim light of their living room, the house steady around them. She did not ask whether he was certain. She knew he was. Instead, she placed her hand gently over his and allowed silence to communicate solidarity. There was no talk of triumph. Only acceptance that consequences, once initiated, would ripple beyond comfort. The morning arrived clear and unremarkable. Alder Ridge buzzed with anticipation of the contract announcement. Harlan stood before cameras, confidence unshaken. Mitchell reviewed final operational notes, satisfied with the momentum they had built. The illusion of safety felt complete. In his study, Grant opened the locked cabinet and removed the sealed complaint he had prepared 2 years earlier. He reviewed it once more, updating a final reference to the newly executed contract and its associated compliance filing. The language remained restrained, factual, supported by evidence accumulated patiently over time. He did not feel anger. He felt alignment. Everything had converged: overextension, reporting deadlines, audit windows, documented discrepancies. The system that had relied on layered complexity now faced structured clarity. Grant reached for his phone, aware that a single call would activate procedures set quietly in motion long before Harlan ever believed himself untouchable. On the morning Harlan finalized his largest contract, Grant made a single call he had prepared for 2 years. They believed they had won. They believed the absence of confrontation meant the absence of consequence. They believed that if a man continued to shake their hands and attend their events, he must have accepted his place beneath them. What they could not see was that Grant Whitaker's silence was not submission. It was calibration. And while they celebrated their expansion, he was measuring the exact height from which they would fall, without ever pushing. Harlan Pierce expanded aggressively in the months that followed. New subdivisions broke ground on the outskirts of Alder Ridge. Commercial complexes were announced with confident projections and carefully staged press photographs. His voice carried through microphones with the tone of a man certain of permanence. Investors applauded his ambition. The town admired his boldness. Mitchell Rowe matched that momentum with operational expansion. He secured additional public contracts tied to regional infrastructure grants. He consolidated accounting oversight under a leaner team, streamlining approvals for efficiency. He invested in civic boards and advisory committees, positioning himself as both businessman and community steward. To most observers, their success appeared not only intact but accelerating. They interpreted Grant's continued composure as confirmation of their safety. In private conversations, they speculated that he lacked the appetite for protracted dispute. They believed his temperament, steady and restrained, signaled reluctance rather than resolve. Silence, in their minds, equaled retreat. Community confidence in them deepened. Newspaper editorials praised their resilience in uncertain markets. Scholarship ceremonies featured their names prominently. Alder Ridge preferred narratives of growth, and Harlan and Mitchell provided them generously. The illusion of safety solidified. Grant allowed it. He attended the groundbreaking of a new municipal complex without visible tension. He reviewed quarterly summaries without objection. He permitted capital reinvestment initiatives to proceed. Each decision was intentional. He was waiting not for emotional satisfaction but for structural overextension. Aggressive growth requires leverage. Leverage requires disclosure. Disclosure invites scrutiny. Strategic patience defined his rhythm. He embodied the quiet promise he had once formed in solitude, to watch and wait. While Harlan pursued expansion headlines, Grant analyzed balance sheets for signs of overcommitment. While Mitchell optimized operational flow, Grant traced compliance reporting schedules tied to each federally funded contract. He observed how growth increased their exposure to regulatory review cycles. At home, Eleanor sensed the tightening convergence of events. She did not question her husband's restraint, yet internally she felt the weight of impending shift. There is a particular tension that precedes change, not loud but palpable, like air thickening before a storm. She trusted Grant's judgment, even when the timeline stretched longer than comfort would prefer. Her trust was not passive. It was active faith in his discipline. Caleb, now more aware than ever, sensed inevitability without understanding specifics. He noticed how his father marked dates quietly in a leather-bound planner. He observed the deliberate calm in Grant's movements, as if every action was paced according to an invisible clock. From this, the boy absorbed a lesson about endurance, that justice sometimes moves slowly not because it is weak, but because it is thorough. Federal reporting deadlines approached with mechanical certainty. Infrastructure grants required annual compliance certifications affirming accurate ownership structures and financial disclosures. Audit windows narrowed as project funding disbursements increased. The more aggressively Harlan and Mitchell expanded, the more documentation they were obligated to submit. Each submission created another opportunity for inconsistency to surface. Grant coordinated quietly with regulatory authorities through his attorney. Preliminary inquiries were framed as requests for clarification rather than accusations. Documentation packets were prepared with chronological precision. Forensic analyses were updated to reflect recent financial statements. There was no urgency in his tone, only readiness. He ensured that when the moment arrived, the complaint would not appear reactive. It would appear inevitable. Meanwhile, Harlan finalized negotiations on his largest contract yet, a regional infrastructure initiative that would anchor his firm's reputation beyond county lines. The project promised long-term profitability and elevated visibility. Mitchell celebrated the operational milestone privately, confident that their streamlined systems could handle the scale. They saw expansion as validation. Grant saw convergence. He understood that this contract triggered a new layer of federal oversight, including mandatory ownership verification aligned with compliance disclosures. Any misrepresentation, even historical, could jeopardize eligibility and prompt comprehensive audit. The timing he had calculated months earlier now aligned precisely with reporting obligations. Everything was in place: documented forged signatures, unauthorized equity shifts, subsidiary shell transfers, and compliance discrepancies. Eleanor felt the shift the evening before the contract signing. Grant was quieter than usual, not burdened but focused. They sat together in the dim light of their living room, the house steady around them. She did not ask whether he was certain. She knew he was. Instead, she placed her hand gently over his and allowed silence to communicate solidarity. There was no talk of triumph. Only acceptance that consequences, once initiated, would ripple beyond comfort. The morning arrived clear and unremarkable. Alder Ridge buzzed with anticipation of the contract announcement. Harlan stood before cameras, confidence unshaken. Mitchell reviewed final operational notes, satisfied with the momentum they had built. The illusion of safety felt complete. In his study, Grant opened the locked cabinet and removed the sealed complaint he had prepared 2 years earlier. He reviewed it once more, updating a final reference to the newly executed contract and its associated compliance filing. The language remained restrained, factual, supported by evidence accumulated patiently over time. He did not feel anger. He felt alignment. Everything had converged: overextension, reporting deadlines, audit windows, documented discrepancies. The system that had relied on layered complexity now faced structured clarity. Grant reached for his phone, aware that a single call would activate procedures set quietly in motion long before Harlan ever believed himself untouchable. On the morning Harlan finalized his largest contract, Grant made a single call he had prepared for 2 years. They believed nothing would happen. They believed even if suspicion existed, it would remain rumor, softened by time and diluted by reputation. They believed accountability, if it came at all, would arrive loudly, through confrontation, accusation, or spectacle. What they did not expect was that consequences would arrive quietly, methodically, and without emotion. They did not expect the kind of reckoning that does not shout, because it does not need to. The call Grant Whitaker made that morning did not feel dramatic. It was measured, brief, and procedural. Documentation previously submitted through counsel was formally activated within the appropriate federal channels. Compliance authorities acknowledged receipt. An audit review was opened automatically under statutory mandate once the ownership discrepancies were flagged against the newly executed contract filings. There were no raised voices. Only systems responding to evidence. Within days, federal investigators initiated formal inquiries. Requests for documentation were delivered electronically first, then through certified mail. Financial institutions received notice to preserve relevant records pending review. Certain operating accounts connected to the subsidiary entity were temporarily frozen under standard investigative protocol. None of this was public yet. It unfolded through channels designed to prevent interference. Harlan Pierce learned of the inquiry not through rumor, but through official correspondence referencing compliance inconsistencies tied to federal reporting. Mitchell Rowe received parallel notification concerning fiduciary obligations and ownership certifications. The language was sterile. Objective. Free of accusation beyond documented discrepancy. That sterility unsettled them more than outrage would have. Public records were subpoenaed methodically. Historical filings, amended agreements, internal approval logs, and bank transfers were requested in full. Digital metadata accompanied hard copies. The architecture of complexity that once provided insulation now provided detail. Every layered amendment became another thread investigators could trace. Court filings followed quietly. A civil complaint, prepared long before emotion could distort its clarity, was formally entered into the appropriate jurisdiction. It alleged breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, and unauthorized redistribution of partnership equity. Attached exhibits spanned years. Forensic analysis confirmed signature inconsistencies. Ownership timelines were charted with precision. There was no inflammatory language. Only fact. There were no confrontations in parking lots. No heated exchanges in boardrooms. Grant did not call Harlan demanding explanation. He did not attend Mitchell's office unannounced. Procedure replaced drama. When news finally reached Alder Ridge, it did so through a regional business journal reporting that a federal compliance review had been initiated concerning a major infrastructure contract. The article referenced ownership discrepancies and potential misrepresentation. It did not speculate. It cited filings. It mentioned pending investigation. The town was stunned. Conversations that once carried admiration now carried uncertainty. Concern shifted direction, no longer directed toward the Whitaker's investment judgment but toward the integrity of those who had stood confidently at podiums. Community leaders, once comfortable in association, adopted cautious neutrality. Invitations slowed. Appearances were postponed. Harlan and Mitchell were blindsided not by accusation, but by documentation. They had anticipated confrontation, perhaps even negotiation. They had not anticipated forensic timelines, compliance cross-references, and metadata authentication aligning with federal oversight triggers. They retained counsel immediately, issuing carefully worded public statements affirming cooperation and confidence in eventual clarification. Grant did not respond publicly. He declined interview requests. He offered no commentary at community gatherings. When approached gently by acquaintances seeking reassurance, he answered simply that procedures were underway and that he trusted the process. His composure remained unchanged. He did not exhibit satisfaction. He exhibited steadiness. Eleanor carried herself with quiet dignity. At the community center, she continued her volunteer work without reference to unfolding events. Those who once expressed polite sympathy now offered tentative apologies for assumptions previously made. She accepted neither apology nor praise with excess. Her grace felt neither triumphant nor wounded. It felt grounded. Caleb observed history unfolding not through spectacle but through example. He saw that justice did not require noise. He watched as his father maintained routine, morning coffee at the same hour, evening walks through familiar streets, while institutions moved deliberately around him. From this, he absorbed a lesson more powerful than confrontation could have taught, that patience, when anchored in truth, does not tremble. As investigators progressed, financial assets tied to questionable transfers remained restricted pending clarification. Internal audits within the firm revealed discrepancies beyond the original complaint. Administrative staff, once insulated from ownership details, were required to provide sworn statements regarding document processing and amendment procedures. Layers of assumption began to peel back under procedural light. Grant felt no impulse to celebrate. There were no private declarations of vindication. When his attorney updated him regarding procedural developments, he listened attentively and asked measured questions. His objective had never been humiliation. It had been correction. The slow-build catharsis emerged not from spectacle but from alignment. For years, the system built on smiles had relied on the belief that reputation could outpace scrutiny. Now scrutiny had caught up, not with fury, but with clarity. Weeks into the investigation, preliminary findings suggested that ownership misrepresentation may have influenced eligibility criteria for multiple federally funded contracts. This expanded the scope beyond private partnership dispute. It introduced regulatory implications that extended across years. Grant received this update in his study, the same room where documentation had first accumulated in quiet stacks. He closed his eyes briefly, not in relief but in acknowledgement of gravity. The matter had grown larger than personal restitution. It now touched the integrity of public trust. He understood then that consequences, once set in motion, rarely confine themselves neatly to original intention. They ripple outward, revealing patterns hidden beneath comfort. The investigation uncovered something more unsettling than a single breach. It identified prior partnership restructurings mirroring the pattern he had experienced. Names surfaced, former minority investors who had exited quietly, their losses rationalized as strategic shifts. Investigators began contacting them for corroboration. The process was no longer about one contract. It was about a history. And as files reopened and timelines extended backward, it became clear that the investigation had uncovered victims who had been silent for over a decade. They believed reputation was permanent. They believed years of applause could not be undone by paperwork. They believed that even if the law questioned them, the town would protect them. What they did not understand was that when truth rises slowly, it does not explode, it settles. And when it settles, it changes everything quietly, permanently, and without asking permission. The first fracture appeared in the business community. Regional partners who had once pursued Harlan Pierce aggressively for joint ventures began issuing cautious statements about pausing collaboration pending clarification. Contracts under negotiation were quietly suspended. Financial institutions, attentive to federal review flags, re-evaluated lending exposure. Lines of credit narrowed. Invitations to expansion meetings slowed. None of these responses were dramatic. They were procedural. And procedure has a way of draining confidence from even the boldest facade. Mitchell Rowe responded with visible effort to stabilize perception. He scheduled meetings with stakeholders, circulated internal memos affirming compliance cooperation, and engaged public relations consultants to reinforce a narrative of transparency. His language was measured, but beneath it lay urgency. He believed that swift reassurance could preserve structural integrity. He underestimated the weight of documented timelines. Media coverage widened beyond regional business journals. A national trade publication summarized the compliance review, citing court filings and referencing prior partnership restructurings now under examination. The article did not sensationalize, it enumerated. Dates, amounts, subsidiary registrations, and federal contract identifiers were presented in orderly columns. For a firm built on public confidence, enumeration felt more destabilizing than accusation. Alder Ridge could no longer rely on comfort. The town had admired Harlan's generosity and Mitchell's operational precision for years. Now it was forced to confront a difficult realization: loyalty, when unexamined, can become blindness. Conversations at coffee shops shifted from admiration to reflection. Community leaders who had once stood confidently beside podiums adopted careful distance. The shift was not cruel. It was sober. Prior minority partners, once silent, began responding to investigator outreach. Their stories aligned with patterns already documented. Gradual equity dilution. Unexpected capital calls. Amendments presented as administrative necessities. None described overt hostility. Instead, they described confusion followed by quiet withdrawal. The repetition unsettled even those who had defended Harlan and Mitchell most vigorously. Omnisciently, Harlan's internal confidence began to fracture. He had always believed his intentions were justified by outcome, that expansion benefited the town, that redistribution was merely strategic recalibration. He told himself that no one was truly harmed beyond temporary discomfort. Yet as documentation surfaced and former partners corroborated discrepancies, he felt something unfamiliar: doubt. Not public doubt, which he masked skillfully, but private unease. He began revisiting decisions once made casually, wondering when justification had drifted into rationalization. Mitchell focused on containment. He reorganized internal compliance teams, retained additional legal counsel, and attempted to distinguish administrative error from intentional misrepresentation. His approach was technical rather than reflective. He believed the matter could still be negotiated within procedural boundaries. But institutions, once engaged, operate beyond persuasion. They follow evidence. Grant Whitaker declined every interview request. Reporters contacted him respectfully, seeking narrative counterpoint. He responded with brief statements affirming trust and due process. He did not recount personal frustration. He did not describe sleepless nights or financial strain. His refusal to dramatize the matter unsettled those who expected visible vindication. Silence, once mistaken for weakness, now conveyed composure. Justice unfolded not through spectacle but through institutional rhythm. Audit findings expanded. Additional contracts were scrutinized. Compliance reviews extended to associated subsidiaries. Temporary asset restrictions evolved into structured oversight conditions. Legal proceedings advanced through scheduled hearings rather than public confrontations. The correction felt steady rather than explosive. Eleanor experienced a quiet restoration of community respect. Those who once offered subtle sympathy for perceived financial misjudgment now expressed admiration for her steadiness. She accepted their shifted tone without resentment. Her grace throughout the ordeal had not been strategic, it had been genuine. In that authenticity, she reclaimed something deeper than reputation. She reclaimed trust. Caleb understood legacy differently now. He had witnessed his father absorb suspicion without protest and pursue accountability without spectacle. He learned that strength does not require applause. It requires alignment between action and principle. Watching the town recalibrate its loyalty taught him that admiration can be misplaced, but integrity endures. There was no gloating within the Whitaker home. When court updates arrived indicating further validation of documented breaches, Grant acknowledged them with quiet nods rather than celebration. He never described Harlan or Mitchell as enemies. He referred to them as men facing consequence. There was no emotional speech delivered at dinner tables. Only continued routine, continued presence. As months passed, structural fallout solidified. Contracts were revoked pending compliance resolution. Business alliances dissolved. Advisory board positions quietly transitioned to other leaders. Harlan and Mitchell retained legal representation and maintained public statements of cooperation, yet the aura of untouchability had evaporated. Reputation, once assumed permanent, proved contingent. The slow-build catharsis did not arrive in a single moment. It emerged gradually, like morning light revealing a landscape altered overnight. Alder Ridge adjusted its understanding of power and trust. It recognized, perhaps for the first time, that generosity without transparency is incomplete. Yet amid institutional correction, one matter remained unresolved. The Federal Compliance Review addressed regulatory accountability. The civil proceedings addressed fiduciary breach. But restitution, the restoration of what had been taken from the Whitaker family, depended on one final claim still pending adjudication. Grant reviewed the status update from his attorney in the quiet of his study. The claim encompassed recalculated equity, diverted distributions, and consequential damages aligned with documented dilution. It was comprehensive. It was substantiated. And it would determine not merely symbolic correction, but tangible restoration. He closed the file gently, aware that this final step carried emotional weight beyond institutional accountability. Recovery was not about wealth. It was about closure. One final civil claim remained, and it would determine whether the Whitakers recovered everything. They believed time would protect them. They believed memory would soften, that years would blur the details, that the town would eventually prefer comfort over correction. They believed the Whitakers would grow tired, accept partial resolution, and quietly rebuild without demanding full restoration. What they never understood was that some families do not fight loudly, they endure completely. And endurance, when guided by truth, leaves a legacy that time cannot erase. The civil judgment arrived on an ordinary morning, without spectacle or ceremony. It came as a formal ruling, carefully worded and thoroughly reasoned, affirming breach of fiduciary duty and authorizing full financial restitution based on recalculated equity, diverted distributions, and documented compliance violations. The numbers were precise. The language was restrained. The conclusion was unmistakable. Grant Whitaker read the judgment alone first, seated in the same study where the first discrepancies had once unsettled him. He did not exhale sharply. He did not close his eyes in triumph. He simply read every page slowly, honoring the weight of process that had carried them to this moment. The restoration was comprehensive. What had been diluted was recalculated. What had been redirected was accounted for. What had been minimized was acknowledged in full. Financial restoration followed in structured phases. Restricted assets were released pursuant to court order. Equity positions were recalibrated. Settlement transfers were executed under judicial supervision. The system that once concealed complexity now enforced clarity. It was not dramatic. It was exact. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing came not through apology tours or emotional declarations, but through formal statements filed in court and summarized in local reporting. The language did not confess character flaws. It admitted documented misrepresentation and procedural breach. For a town that had once celebrated confidence without question, the acknowledgement felt sobering. There was no celebration inside the Whitaker home. Eleanor prepared dinner that evening as she always had, setting plates with the same steady hands. Caleb returned from school with quiet awareness that something significant had concluded. Grant joined them at the table without announcement. The air did not carry triumph. It carried closure. Grant's philosophy, though rarely spoken aloud, had been revealed through action. Justice is not loud. It does not need to humiliate to correct. Patience is not weakness. It is strength disciplined by time. He had never sought to destroy Harlan Pierce or Mitchell Rowe. He had sought to restore balance. Institutions had done the rest. Eleanor felt a quiet pride that required no audience. She had watched her husband endure suspicion without resentment and pursue accountability without bitterness. She understood that true dignity is not proven when life is easy. It is revealed when restraint could have given way to anger and did not. Her respect for him deepened not because he had won, but because he had remained himself throughout. Caleb absorbed the outcome differently. He did not measure the result in numbers. He measured it in example. He had seen how silence can protect clarity, how documentation can protect truth, how patience can outlast manipulation. The lesson would travel with him into adulthood long after the headlines faded. Legacy is rarely inherited through wealth alone. It is inherited through character demonstrated under pressure. Alder Ridge adjusted slowly. The town did not crumble. It recalibrated. New leadership emerged within the construction firm under compliance oversight. Community initiatives continued, now accompanied by increased transparency. The illusion that reputation alone guarantees integrity had dissolved. In its place grew a quieter understanding. Accountability strengthens institutions more than admiration ever could. Harlan and Mitchell faced their own reckonings, not only legal but internal. Omnisciently, it became clear that consequence carries weight beyond financial penalty. Reflection, though slower than denial, has its own gravity. Whether regret matured into genuine remorse remained private. Grant did not monitor their transformation. His responsibility ended with correction. In the months that followed, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Morning walks returned. Community gatherings felt lighter, not because conflict had been erased, but because it had been resolved. Grant no longer maintained binders of evidence. The locked cabinet remained, but it held memory rather than urgency. The universal truth settled gently over the town and beyond it. Some people wait for time to heal wounds. Others use time to build accountability. Both approaches require endurance. Only one restores balance. As seasons shifted, the Whitaker name carried new meaning, not of scandal, not of victimhood, but of steadiness. Their story did not become legend. It became example. And examples travel farther than applause ever does. There was no final speech delivered in a courtroom hallway. No declaration of victory offered to cameras. Grant declined invitations to speak publicly about resilience. He believed lessons are strongest when observed, not advertised. His satisfaction rested not in public vindication, but in quiet restoration. They believed time would make the Whitakers forget. They were wrong. If this story moved you, if patience and integrity still matter in a world that often rewards noise, then stay connected. Subscribe, press the bell icon, and share this story with someone who believes silence is weakness, because sometimes silence is the beginning of justice. And now let me ask you something that lingers long after the paperwork is signed. If someone believed hurting your family would be forgotten over time, would you react in anger, or would you have the patience to let time work for you?